Hey everyone, welcome to Village Youth. My name is Justin. I'm one of the youth associates here at Village Church, and we're about to jump into a brand new series called 4 Big Questions, where we're trying to answer questions about some really big, important topics. We're gonna be talking about addiction, mental health, social media, and justice. And what we kind of want to do is we want to look at what does the world and culture have to say about these topics? What does the Bible and Jesus have to say about these topics? And in light of all of that, how do you and I respond? So I'm going to be your host for the next number of weeks, but we are doing something exciting where we're going to be hearing from a number of different experts, their experience and their knowledge on all of these different topics. It's going to be really awesome. So this episode, we're going to be hearing from my friend Colin as he shares about his experience with struggles with addiction. Before we jump into that, we are going to turn to the people next to you and answer this question. But if you're watching this on your own, think about this question and share your answer with somebody you trust later. When you have big questions, where do you go for answers?
Hey Village Youth, my name is Colin and I'm one of the youth associates at Village Church. I am so looking forward to meeting with you today as we are talking about the topic of addiction. Now, the thing about addiction for me is that it's not just this ethereal topic where I'm just going to be giving you a bunch of information, but rather I'm actually going to be sharing my story. Because, I've been in youth ministry vocationally for just about 8 years now. And if you were going to ask me maybe just over 10 years ago if I could ever see myself doing this, I'd probably laugh at you. Because a little over 10 years ago, my life looked vastly different. When I was in Bible college, I had this one prof that would always say to us, oftentimes your mess becomes your ministry. And that is actually the truth about my life, because a little over 10 years ago, my life was really, really broken. I was living a life that was extremely destructive. I was living a life that was destructive not only to myself, but to those around me. And a little over 10 years ago, I would say that I was a drug addict. But the beautiful thing is that in the midst of one of the most dark moments of my life, a situation of my life that looked hopeless, where I didn't know which way to turn, that's where I experienced Jesus in a radical way. So that's what I want to be able to share with you today. So just to kind of rewind the tape back a little bit, I didn't initially grow up in a Christian home. I grew up in Edmonton, Alberta. I had my mom and my dad, they were married together. My grandma was actually living with us at the time when I was younger, and I have a little sister. And growing up, my life was actually pretty normal. I was involved in a lot of different sports and activities. I played soccer, I was in running club, I took karate. There was a lot of things that kept me busy in life. And to be honest, I was actually a pretty social kid. I had quite a few friends. I felt pretty confident and comfortable in my own skin, and life was looking pretty good. And although my family didn't attend church, the thing that's really interesting is that my family, we did have a reverence for this idea of God. My mom, she grew up Anglican, my dad grew up Catholic. So the idea of God was in my life, but when it came to actually following Jesus and having a personal relationship with him, that was something that wasn't really a part of our lives. Just to kind of move forward, when I was 8 years old, life took a little bit of a turn. Like I said, life was looking pretty normal and life was looking pretty happy. But when I was 8 years old, my parents, they had to sit me down because they had something to tell me. And I remember the day just like it was yesterday. Over 20 years ago, my parents sat me down in the living room. And I remember in that moment, I was thinking, man, my parents, I'm in trouble. I did something wrong. I'm thinking what did I do last week? What was the lie that I told yesterday? I'm trying to play the tape of what did I do in this moment for my parents to sit me down. And I remember my parents sat me down and they just said, Colin, we're sorry to tell you, but your dad and I are actually splitting up. I remember at that moment, even though I was only 8 years old, I knew my life was changing forever. And my parents told me that it was only going to be a temporary thing, that my dad and my mom just had to figure things out, but eventually they'd be getting back together. So every single day I was praying for my mom and dad to come back together. And I was praying that my parents' marriage would be able to, be made whole again. Even though I didn't understand who God was, I understood that God was someone that we could pray to. So I prayed every single day. But the reality is that my parents never actually got back together. And I remember that was really difficult. I remember the day where my dad actually came for the rest of his office supplies that were at our house, and I knew that was the day that my dad was fully moving out. And the thing about the divorce is that not only was it something that affected me at home, it affected me in all areas of life. After my parents' divorce, I found that I actually became less confident in who I was. I found that when I went to school, I actually struggled more with social anxiety, feeling like I didn't fit in. I noticed that all the things that I once took interest in, I was no longer interested in. And I felt like I was really alone and broken. So as I got older, I really struggled just to make friendships. I struggled feeling comfortable in my own skin. And I remember it was just actually a really difficult time for me growing up, going into elementary school and then eventually junior high. The thing that was really interesting though, is that after my parents divorced, it was actually when my family started going to church. So I remember my mom, we went to this church and we started checking things out there. She had a friend from my school that recommended a certain church and we started going there, and it was a really awesome time. And we went to the kids' church, and through that experience, I first accepted Jesus into my life. And then I started going to the youth group there. And that was a really interesting time because, the thing that I was always trying to process in my life is, if God is good and God is loving, why is all this brokenness happening in my life? So I went to youth group, I was getting involved, getting plugged in, but the thing that I found really interesting about the youth ministry is that it wasn't really a space that I actually felt like I belonged. It was a space where I actually noticed that I felt more belonging at school than I did in the youth group. And that was something that I always found really interesting for me. As I got a little bit older, at the age of 13, there was someone's house that I had went to, someone that I thought that I could trust. And at this place, I had experienced abuse for the first time in my life. And I remember when I experienced abuse in this moment, it was something that made me feel very ashamed. I was really embarrassed about what happened. I remember it was something that I thought that was my fault. And I remember thinking to myself, God, if you're actually there, God, if you actually love me, why do you let this moment take place? So I remember at that moment, it was a decision that I made where I was going to run away from God and I was going to just run after things that were going to help me feel better. And the thing is that the world often tells us when we experience pain and brokenness in our lives, the pursuit of pleasure is ultimately the thing that's going to help us. So for me, I remember I grew up, as I was growing up, I worked in a lot of restaurants, right? I was a dishwasher, I worked as a busboy. And the thing about working in restaurants is that I knew a lot of people that were older than me. And because I was exposed to people that were older than me, a lot of these older people, they liked to party. They were involved with using drugs. And I remember, I think it was about 14 years old, there was someone that I knew that was smoking pot. And I thought, hey, you know what? Maybe this is the thing that's actually going to help me. Maybe this is the thing that's actually going to help with the pain that's in my life. Maybe this is the thing that's actually going to soothe the brokenness and all the things that I'd gone through. So I decided to run away from God and decided to run towards drugs. So when I was about 14 years old, that's when I started smoking weed. And the thing about that is that I fell in love with it right away. I loved the way that it made me feel. And the thing is that not only did I think that it was actually helping me deal with the pain that was in my life, when I went into high school, I met other people that smoked weed as well. And the thing about that is that all of a sudden I felt like, hey, I actually have people that I belong to. I actually have a community that I can connect with. And all of a sudden I felt like, hey, there's actually people that want to spend time with me, and we'd smoke weed at lunchtime, and it just became a part of my life. It became a part of my identity. And the only problem is that as I was hanging out with those kind of people, all of a sudden you start to be exposed to other drugs and other substances. So I remember all of a sudden, I had friends that were starting to experiment with things like ecstasy and mushrooms and acid. And for the longest time, I thought I would never touch any of those things. But I remember after enough peer pressure, after enough convincing, I remember I tried ecstasy with one of my good friends for the very first time. And after I did that, the floodgates opened. All of a sudden, I wanted to try everything under the sun. So I was trying different types of psychedelics. When I was about 15 years old, I had tried cocaine for the first time. And I remember I thought these drugs were just things that were, not a big deal. I thought I was just experimenting. I thought I was just having fun. By the time I was 16 years old, I had friends that were starting to experiment with prescription drugs, things called opiates. Drugs that people often get prescribed when they're experiencing pain or just after a surgery. So I remember all of my friends, we were starting to play around, but we had no idea the trap that we were making for ourselves. And the thing that was crazy is I had no idea the path that this was actually going to take me down. So the thing about this is that all of a sudden it started to lead me down a path of extreme addiction, extreme pain, and extreme destruction. So here's the reality about addiction. Nobody wakes up and says, hey, I want to be a drug addict. Oftentimes, the road to addiction is just one small compromise at a time. And that's exactly what I experienced. One small choice leading to another one, where all of a sudden, further down the road, you look at yourself in the mirror wondering, how on earth did I get here? And I remember by the time I started to experiment with some of those harder drugs, things went downhill really quick. It got to the point, the thing with opiates is that I not only was psychologically addicted, like not only was I experiencing cravings and just wanting to use them all the time, but I actually got to the point where I was so physically addicted to the drugs. I got to the point where I actually couldn't get up in the morning and be able to get through my day because I was so sick going through the drug withdrawals. So remember, there was points where like I would do anything I could to be able to go and purchase the drugs. I would lie to whoever I needed to. I did whatever I could to steal to be able to pay for the drugs. And all of a sudden, I was really becoming a person that I never thought that I'd become. You know what was really interesting is that I remember there was this one weekend where my dad, he came to pick me up for a weekend to go spend the time at his place. And I remember my dad came to the door and he was like, "Hey Colin, go get your stuff ready. It's time to go to my place." And I remember he took one look at me and he knew that something was wrong. He knew that something was wrong with his boy. And I remember I told my dad, I'm like, "Dad, I'm not gonna go visit you this weekend. I'm not really feeling good." And I just told him, "Hey, I'll see you next time." My dad left, and of course my dad, he likes to research things. So my dad went online and he started researching all sorts of things about drug use because my dad knew that there was something wrong with me. My dad called me a few days later and he said, "Hey Colin, how long have you been using drugs for?" And immediately I panicked, right? Because I had been found out. My dad had found out what I had been doing. And I was like, "Dad, you don't know what you're talking about." And I hung up the phone. I was so embarrassed and so ashamed. I didn't want to admit to what I was doing. But then there was this moment where I thought, hey, what if I actually do have a problem? What if I actually can't stop what I'm doing? And I tried in my own efforts to stop using because I knew that like what was happening, this actually wasn't good for me. But here's the problem. I couldn't stop. No matter how hard I tried, no matter how much willpower I had in the moment, there was nothing that I could do to actually stop my drug use. So I called my dad a little bit later and I said, "Hey Dad, you're right. This is actually a thing in my life and I don't know how to stop." And the beautiful thing is that my dad showed up in a big way. Not only did my earthly father show up in a big way, but the beautiful thing when I look back is that I see that God was actually hunting me down too. The thing about my road to recovery is that it was a long one. There was many failures. There was many times where I'd relapse, I'd do well for a bit, I'd relapse, I'd do well for a bit, and then I'd relapse again. I tried going to treatment centers, I tried going to detox programs, I tried doing what I could to be able to stop. But the thing is that no matter what I seemed to try to do, nothing could ever fill that void that I was trying to fill in my life. And I remember my addiction got so bad where like I was just so sick all the time. My family, they didn't know what to do with me. And I remember there's this one time where my dad came to pick me up and I was sitting with him in the truck and I just broke. And I just said to him, like, "Dad, like, I'm an embarrassment of a son. Like, you've got to be so ashamed of me. You got to be so disappointed. Like, why haven't you given up on me yet? Like, all I am is a drug addict." And I remember my dad, he said these words to me, and I feel like these are the same words that Jesus was saying to me in this moment. And my dad said to me, he said, "Colin, you're my son. You'll always be my son. I'm never giving up on you." You know, oftentimes when we see people that are struggling with addiction, we dehumanize them. We stigmatize them. We think that, oh, they're just an addict, and it's so easy to cast them off to the side. But the beautiful thing is that there's actually a person behind the story of addiction. And the thing about God is that he actually looks at those people and he sees their story and he sees their pain and he wants to bring restoration and healing to them. So to move the story forward a little bit, like, I mean, again, it was a crazy process of trying to get help, trying to get better, but nothing that I seemed to do seemed to help. But there was this church that planted across the street from my parents' house. And I was living with my dad at the time. And my parents went to go to this church to check things out. And they went to go talk to the pastor. And they said, "Hey, Pastor Rob, we would love for you to meet with our son. He's struggling with addiction. We don't know what to do. And we'd love for you to be able to take the time to connect with him." So I remember they set up a coffee time for me to meet with the pastor. I was terrified. I was thinking, like, why did you do this to me? I don't want to meet with a religious person. I don't want to meet with a pastor because there's no way that this person would accept me. There's no way that this person would actually want to show me love, especially with all the stuff that I was doing in my life. And they set me up to go to the Starbucks and, you know, I decided to go and I was terrified. But I remember I went to the Starbucks and I sat down to go meet with this pastor and I was blown away by the response. He didn't show judgment. He didn't look down upon me. He didn't shame me for the things that I was doing, but he shared the love of Jesus to me. He said, "Colin, Jesus loves you so much. Jesus wants to restore your life. This is not the end of your story. Jesus wants to take this brokenness and use it for his glory." I was so blown away. So he actually got me to get more plugged into this church. And to be honest, I was still struggling with using drugs. But the beautiful thing is that nobody there judged me for it. They loved me. They embraced me. They prayed for me. They championed me. They encouraged me. They did whatever they could to try to see me get success and overcome this addiction in my life. And there was to be honest, there was this point in my life where I got into a bunch of trouble with the police, and they showed up at my house. And to be honest, one of the cops that showed up was actually a Christian, and she shared the gospel with me even when she was at my place. But I remember I came to this point where I was at the end of my rope. I was at rock bottom, as you often hear people talk about. And I had gone to this detox program downtown Edmonton to get the drugs out of my system. And I remember just feeling totally at the end of myself. And I remember crying out to God, being like, God, you got to be so done with me. There's no way that you have a purpose for my life. God, I've messed up too many times. There's no way that you can redeem this situation. And I remember I got home from detox. My family didn't know what to do with me. And I went downstairs to my room in the basement. And I remember just being so broken. And I cried out to God, like the most I've ever cried out to God in my life. And I said, God, if you're real, I need you to show up in my life. Because either I'm going to end up dead or in jail. And I need you to totally make my life new. And I remember this was the clearest I've ever heard God's voice in my life. And he said, Colin, the same words as my dad. Colin, I love you. You're my son. You've always been my son. But if you want your life to change, you have to give me everything. And I remember at that moment, I had this sense of peace that just showed up in my room. It was this tangible presence of God that I had never experienced before in my life. And I remember I felt just led. There's this program that I had heard about so many different times from so many different people. It was this program called Teen Challenge, where you go away for a year, and it's basically like this intense rehab program that's centered around Jesus. And I just felt, hey, I'm supposed to go to this place. So I remember applying online to this Teen Challenge program, and I was just like, God, I just want to give you everything. I just want to surrender everything to you. The next morning, I woke up and I told my parents that I had applied for this program, and they were totally blown away. Because I was resisting going to this place for so long. No matter how many people suggested it to me, I just kept shrugging it off, saying, hey, I don't want to go. But you know what? God showed up in my life. God changed my heart, and I felt led this is where I was meant to go. So I went to Teen Challenge. It was a one-year program. It was so difficult to go through. I don't have nearly enough time to tell you how strict this program was. But the beautiful part about this program is that I encountered Jesus in such a deep way. I understood what does it mean to actually follow Jesus in all aspects of my life. And I remember there were so many areas where God brought healing and restoration, and there was so much healing in my family. Do you know what's really crazy is that in the midst of me going through this program, there were so many of my family members that actually came to know Jesus through it. It was so amazing to look at the fact that, hey, God can take a situation that's so broken and turn it into something beautiful. You know, it wasn't too much longer after that. You know, there was some beautiful things that happened in my life where I went to Bible college. I actually met my wife, Kelly, and our relationship started. But I had this burden and call to be serving in youth ministry. I kind of had this sense where I'm like, I think God actually wants to help or wants to use me to help be able to create spaces for young people to encounter Jesus and to be able to belong into community. So that's when I decided to start leading in youth ministry. The thing that was really cool is I actually got to lead the youth ministry at the church that pastor, the one that took me out for coffee, he actually offered me a job to be able to lead the youth ministry at that church. And that was an amazing experience. But ever since then, I've had this burden and this vision and this heart just to be able to see students, to be able to actually be in an environment where they can be loved, where they can belong, where they can actually experience a culture no matter what they've done, no matter who they are, no matter what mistakes they've made in the past, no matter what they're struggling with. They can experience the love and the grace of Jesus, not just from what is being taught at the front of the room, but also just the experience of what it's like to enter into a small group and be surrounded by people that care about them. So Village Youth, as we take this time to just process this problem of addiction, there's a few things that I just wanted to address. I want to address, one, that Jesus is the hope that we can have. At the end of the day, Jesus can take these broken situations, and he's the one that can actually bring true healing and restoration. But the second thing that I want to remind us of is that regardless of whether we struggle with drugs or not, we're all in recovery of sin. At the end of the day, we all have things that we're working out in our lives. And I think the thing that we have to be humble about is that we're all in desperate need of Jesus in our lives. So it's one of those things where addicts aren't just these people that are out there, these people that are stigmatized, these people that are doing extreme drug things, maybe like I did. But at the end of the day, we're all struggling with sin. We all need grace in our lives, and we all need to be able to be close to Jesus. But the last thing that I want to just kind of give us a picture for is what would it look like for us as a youth ministry to actually be able to create spaces that are just a place of belonging, a place of acceptance, a place that no matter who you are, no matter what you've done, you can experience being loved, being known, being accepted. You can experience being loved. You can experience the gospel not only being taught from the front of the room, but also in the culture of the small groups that we have in our groups. And just to end off, if you're someone that's starting to go down a path where maybe you're experiencing similarities to me, maybe you're starting to experiment with certain things, or you're starting to have habits in your life where you're noticing they're taking a hold on you, the thing that I want to encourage you is that your small group and your small group leaders, that's a space where you can actually reach out for help. That's a space where you can actually reach out to be able to get encouragement, to be able to receive prayer. Just know that this is a safe space where you can seek out help if you're going down a path that you know maybe isn't the best for you. But hey, Village Youth, I'm just so thankful for you just taking the time to listen to my story. And I just hope that there's something that resonates with you. But let's just be a people and a space that are loving, that are gospel-centered, where Jesus and his love are able to be just shared and represented in the community that we build together. Thank you so much for listening. We'll talk soon.
Wow, it was so encouraging to hear Colin's story and to understand that Jesus can take the most broken situations, like addiction, and he can bring about true healing and restoration. I hope this was really helpful for you. I know it was helpful for me. What we're gonna do now is we are gonna go to our small groups and have a discussion about this. But if you're someone who's watching this all on your own, I would encourage you to think about what we just talked about and go and talk about it with someone you trust. Hey, that's all we have for this episode. We will see you guys next time.